his column that it should be broken into a lot of pieces and dumped in the deepest part of the San Francisco Bay. It stirred up a lot of anger. Bob's life was threatened twice. We had news people camped out on our front porch.
Irreverent, irrepressible, impish, whatever you call him, whatever you think of the Moscone bust, I think if you spent a few minutes with Robert Arneson, you'd find it impossible not to like him.
I kind of hoped that Bob would be kind of a chum, and he never was that. He kind of stayed at a distance. Most of the time he would work in his studio and maybe come over to my studio once a week or maybe once a day and kind of poke his nose in and poke around and make some sort of flippant comments that were always sort of critical or trying to create confusion. And I finally decided he was kind of like one of those Zen masters throwing out a koan, where he would say something that was basically impossible to interpret or solve, but it would cause you to think.
Bob was frank. He didn't mince words. You knew what he thought about things. He didn't let you get away with an ambiguous remark. But you often had the feeling with him that he was burrowing in to try and see what was behind your face.
He did always ask, well, what are you doing here? Why are you doing this? Or in my case, one time he said, you're imitating me. I don't want you to do that. I would either have to acknowledge that I was doing that or refute that notion and say that I wasn't, which would get us into an argument. And he could get quite angry about it and upset because he was screaming a number of times at me and I was screaming right back at him,
I like art that has humor, wit, irony, and playfulness. I want to make high art that is outrageous and exposes the frailties of the human condition. The danger in this, of course, is that one can come up with some silly, stupid stuff. Why play safe? Clay can't hurt you. For about the past 10 years or so, I've been modeling oversized portrait heads of myself in clay. I like to model faces that talk back to you. Faces, after all, are what most of us relate to. The human face, unlike frogs, is a window on the mind.
Bob was often asked why he used the self-portrait, and his answer was always that he was a model who was there for himself, and he didn't have to worry about what he was doing to himself. He could explore gestures like sticking your tongue out or sticking your finger up your nose or gouging your eye out that might be offensive if it were you or me.
Bob had a ferocious desire to go down in history as important an artist as he could. And I think the vehicle of self-portraiture and the kind of persistence with it helps drive that nail deeper.
I can't speak for Bob, but I think it's fair to say that in doing so, he was being really very honest, that so much of the focus of people in any creative activity is somehow themselves. And you can make, as Bob did, yourself kind of as a universal. And his own approach to himself was not narcissistic. It was actually very denigrating. I mean, he would make kind of a fool of himself in sculpture after sculpture.
There is the cliche that artists really have only one image in them, and they're always dancing around that. Well, maybe that's true of him also, but it was an incredible dance he did. I mean, he kept varying this image, this self-portrait, to bring the formal and the human together. And he did this in an extraordinary way, which signaled Arneson, myself. He was able to use this medium of clay, which generally had been used rather impersonally through history, whatever the personal mark of the ceramicist, to make a, as it were, demonstration of himself, to perform himself in a variety of ways, humorously, tragically, to document himself right up to the end of his last works, which dealt with his cancer.
Bob was diagnosed with cancer in 1974, and between 1974 and 1984, he had 35 surgeries. And I believe that his health was always an issue in his work.
As Bob's health began to be a problem, he changed, in many ways, an enormous psychological pressure on him. He became a more, in a certain way, more conventional, but more of a kind of driven figure to fill an art history position. He told me one time that he'd been in a hospital in a prep situation for some kind of surgery or minor for about 80 times. And I remember when I was going to go into have a bypass once, and I was a little jittery about it. And Bob says, well, he said, Roy, he said, I'm living proof that it takes a hell of a lot to kill a person. And somehow it was very comforting.
Bob Arneson did offend some people in the art world who had a very, thought you had to be cool to be philosophical. Bob Arneson was not a cool person, and his approach to art was not cool. It was very involved and very hot and very emotional.
And he was kind also. He was sensitive, but he could also be very crude, you know.
I mean, Bob would have been intolerable taking these positions, except I always had a sneaking suspicion that back of it all, he was really kind of unsure. And he got to a certain point, and his sense of humor would save him. If he had been really dead serious about it and really pompous, it'd have been impossible to deal with.
Bob Arneson was an egotist. He would have to be able to carry on the way he was. He was persistent, never gave up, even in his very earliest work. He hung in there. People admiring it or not admiring it had very little to do with why he made his work. He made the work because he felt that's what he was going to do. He was going to do this, he did it, and if you didn't like it, there was something terribly wrong with you from Bob's point of view. And he's probably right.
He really wanted to live the art figure. He always had a certain amount of ego, and in a melodramatic way, he wanted to be Jasper Johns again, or Jackson Pollock. Not just to make art, but to play the part of an artist, whatever that might mean, you know, and we all know what it means in a romantic kind of a way. Certain excess, say outrageous things. He enjoyed that. He really enjoyed playing the role and being a provocateur. That was an important thing for him to do, to act out that lifestyle. And he did it.
In the 1950s, Peter Voulkos let clay speak. In the 60s, Robert Arneson gave it something to say. And by the 1970s, clay artists were exploring vast new terrain. At Davis, clay artists such as Richard Shaw were redefining the aesthetic that Arneson had so carelessly cultivated. In Los Angeles, John Mason took Voulkos's heroic expressionism to its logical extreme. Mason left the wheel entirely, producing immense chiseled sculptures and majestic freestanding walls of crudely handled clay. Up in Berkeley, Peter Voulkos continued to work primarily in bronze throughout the 1960s. Yet through his teaching, he inspired a new group of young ceramic artists. Though Voulkos now shared center stage with Arneson and the Davis group, his radical innovations had set a new standard, and to young clay artists like James Melchert, Voulkos held near mythic status.
It seemed that everything in his world was better than anything in my world. I remember buying shoes that looked like his shoes, and I started smoking cigarettes and listening to a lot of flamenco music. And it wasn't until several years after I'd worked with him that I realized I now had to shed a lot of things that didn't belong to me, that were part of his personality, his world, that didn't fit with mine.
Melchert's work throughout the late 60s and early 70s confirmed his fascination with the ephemeral, his preoccupation with language, philosophy, and perception. Gradually, Melchert discovered a style all his own. Indulging his interest in philosophy, French literature, and photography, Melchert began to produce conceptual clay. Eventually, he would forgo the notion that the ceramic artist had to produce any ceramic object at all.
One thing about clay that was bothering me a lot by the early 70s is that it was fine for making objects. And yet I wanted to do something that went beyond objects.
During a visit to Amsterdam, Melchert was invited by Dutch artist Hetty Houseman to do ceramic work at her studio. Instead, he devised an experience.
Well, I had set up 2 rows of benches, and between them, at one end, I had a charcoal fire, and then I had some blocks of ice. So, depending on where you would sit, the cold damp of the ice would affect the performance a certain way. The heat of the fire would affect the performance in a certain way. It went very well, because when I went over to this vat of slip that I had prepared, a great big tub of clay slip, then the room grew silent because people thought, my goodness, he's really going to do it. I kneeled down, stuck my head into it, kept my glasses on, and when I came up again, people saw absolutely like a sculpture you've become. What happens when your head is encased in slip is that you become entirely enclosed, so that you hear your heart beating, you can hear your breathing in a very different way, and you are removed from society, from a social context. You can't hear anybody else because your ears are sealed up. And yet, as the slip dried, there would be this explosion like this. And suddenly you heard sounds of other people breathing. Eventually, you could open your eyes, and then you would come back to the world, as it were. Here was a way in which each of us could become removed from one another and return to one another.
Whereas Melchert succeeded in giving clay new relevance by bringing it completely into the present, another student at Berkeley was seeking to create clay work that might reveal the archaic.
I never was involved in pottery, so as a result of not having that orientation, I would try things that were really kind of off the wall. And I used to lay down enormous slabs of clay on the floor and take off my shoes, and if I was in my own studio, just strip down and just trounce the clay, just kind of jump up and down on it and create all kinds of surfaces that you can't get from a little tool. It wasn't until later that I realized I was really trying to find a sculptural equivalent for landscape painting, but not painting with the trees and the rocks, but the essence of landscape. Swellings and depressions and erosions and cracking and shearing and rocks that, kind of crumbly. Clay can do all that because clay is earth, and the very special spirit it has comes from that fact alone. Clay wants to do lots of things on its own, And it's very easy to thwart that by being heavy-handed. A lot of people I know who are very gifted with clay get so clutched up when they try to make something out of the pot vernacular. They have a real hard time taking clay in a free sense, I mean in the sense of letting the clay be free. So the challenge slowly emerged is how to make form happen in clay, letting it do what it wants to do largely, without looking as though you entered into the process at all. So it's like trying to make imagery where you, the maker, are invisible. And slowly inside these landscape forms, the figure was beginning to emerge, but it was a real tough kind of birthing.
The Stabler shares one thing with Voulkos, that is immense mysticism, haunting qualities. Voulkos in abstract forms, the Stabler in emerging forms. One never knows whether one with the Stabler is at a beginning or at an end. One is fully aware, however, that one is in front of an art object of extraordinary, profound emotion.
While Stephen de Stabler pursued an abstract spiritual archaeology, back at the University of Davis, artist Clayton Bailey explored the flip side of the same coin, exploiting clay in pursuit of archaeological fraud.
I never started out to be a potter, actually. I studied at the University of Wisconsin with Harvey Littleton, who was a potter, but I always remembered students calling one another Harvey's followers, and I wanted to be something a little different. When Pete Voulkos came to do a workshop, I remember one comment that he made that he knew his piece was good when it made him laugh. And even though his work didn't make me laugh, I liked that idea. So I started putting noses and lips and teeth on the pots that I was making. Noseware is what I called it.
Though his critters were gaining acclaim at regional ceramic competitions, when Bailey caught a whiff of the stink Robert Arneson and his students were causing out in California, he smelled a winner.
I was doing pretty good in Wisconsin, but I really felt like the excitement was on the West Coast. And when I got to Davis, it was nice to be amongst a group of artists that were more or less all nuts.
But by the time Bailey arrived in 1967, the Davis group had been pinned with the label funk, and Bailey saw little reason to crowd in under their umbrella. Instead, he developed a plan to locate himself at the center of a major new art movement.
I've often been accused of being a funk artist, but I never really have felt comfortable with it because I wasn't one of the funk artists at its inception. And so we always tried to promote the idea of nut art. And I invented Dr. Gladstone as a nut artist so that I could talk about Dr. Gladstone and the strange ideas that he had and the weird things that he had done. Dr. Gladstone would collaborate with another artist, for example, to make the world's largest ceramic piece by dribbling a trail of clay across the country on Highway Route 66. Gladstone really came into his own most prominently as the discoverer of the skeleton of a Bigfoot in my backyard. Gladstone was nominated for a Nobel Prize in Physics in 1978 for the discovery of kaolism, which is the scientific analysis of thermally metamorphized mud to reveal science facts.